In the dusty pages of history lies the name of an emperor known for madness, mystery, and scandal. He ascended the Roman throne at a young age, but chose to break the rules. Welcome to a story filled with blood, desire, and secrets. In the blistering heart of ancient Syria, under the relentless sun and the heavy scent of incense, a child was born who would come to embody the clash of divinity and decadence, of prophecy and power. His given name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, but history would remember him as El-Gabalus, a boy priest destined to shake the foundations of the Roman Empire with fire and silk. From the moment of his birth in the city of Emesa, he was marked by fate. The sacred temple of El-Gabal, the sun god, cast its long shadow over his early years. Raised amidst priests and omens, he was not reared as a typical child of noble blood. Instead, he was taught to commune with the divine, to serve as a living vessel for the radiant God, whose black meteorite stone was said to pulse with celestial power. His family was steeped in both bloodline and ambition. His mother, Julia Soaemias, and grandmother, Julia Mesa, were women of fierce resolve and keen political insight. Julia Mesa, in particular, understood the volatile currents of Roman power and the fragile loyalties of the legions. When Emperor Caracalla was assassinated, a vacuum of power formed that could be filled not merely by sword or Senate decree, but by myth and divine favor. Julia Mesa whispered in the ears of Eastern legions, weaving tales of the Severan dynasty's blood running through her grandson's veins, of celestial signs pointing toward his inevitable rise. The black stone of El-Gabal, carried by Elagabalus himself, became a talisman, a symbol of this divine destiny. At the tender age of 14, amid a world ruled by hardened generals and seasoned senators, Elagabalus was proclaimed emperor. But his arrival in Rome was unlike any before. He came not as a warlord clad in armor, but as a god incarnate, adorned in silks and precious jewels, his face painted with sacred colors that dazzled and unsettled the Roman populace. The procession that accompanied him was not one of military might, but a sacred ritual steeped in Eastern mystery. Priests chanted in foreign tongues, incense smoke curled around marble columns, and the black meteorite stone was borne high on a golden chariot, an earthly embodiment of his sun god's power. Once in power, Elagabalus set out to reorder the very soul of Rome. The ancient gods of the city, the mighty Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, were overshadowed by the blazing presence of El-Gabal. A new temple arose on the Palatine Hill, grander and more opulent than any before it, its golden spires piercing the Roman sky. Daily sacrifices were offered with fervor, the emperor himself leading rituals that stunned the Roman aristocracy and bewildered the masses. The Senate whispered behind closed doors, dismayed by the desecration of their traditions. The old priesthood found itself sidelined, its influence diminished as the cult of the sun god blossomed. Yet it was not only the religious upheaval that fractured Roman society under Elagabalus's reign. His personal life defied every expectation and convention of the rigid empire. Elagabalus blurred the lines of gender and identity with breathtaking audacity. Draped in silks, adorned with jewels, his face painted in vibrant pigments, he declared himself both emperor and empress. He took male lovers openly and with pride, most notably Hierocles, whom he proclaimed his husband before the shocked Senate. Rumors swirled that he sought physicians to transform his body, desiring a womb to fully embody the divine feminine. To the Roman establishment, he was no longer merely an emperor. He was an enigma, a challenge to the very essence of Roman masculinity and power. His court became a theater of spectacle and excess unlike any other. Nights were filled with orgies, scented with rosewater and jasmine, fountains flowed with wine, and wild animals roamed the lavish banquet halls. Guests found themselves buried beneath cascades of rose petals, while servants dressed as gods and angels attended to every whim. The palace itself seemed alive, a labyrinth of pleasures and symbols, a living drama played out beneath shimmering silks and flickering torchlight. Some whispered that Elagabalus conversed with unseen spirits, setting empty chairs at his table in honor of invisible guests, blurring the line between madness and divinity. Outside the palace walls, the city simmered with unrest. Senators murmured of madness, the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's protectors, grew uneasy, and the populace began to mock the boy who ruled like a godchild. Julia Maesa, once the architect of his rise, grew increasingly concerned. She recognized that the empire was fracturing beneath his reign, and that a more conventional leader was needed to preserve the Severan dynasty. Enter Alexander Severus, Elagabalus's cousin, a boy of discipline, reason, and political tact. Presented as a stabilizing force, Alexander's ascent drew the support of the Senate, the Praetorians, and the people. Elagabalus, sensing the shift in loyalty, retaliated. He stripped Alexander of titles, replaced his guards, and threatened those suspected of treason, but the tide was unstoppable. In the chill dawn of March 222, the Praetorian Guard stormed the palace. Elagabalus and his mother fled to the sanctuary of the temple chamber, praying desperately to the sun god for salvation. No answer came. They were seized, brutally slain, and their bodies desecrated, dragged through the streets and cast into the sewers of Rome, discarded and forgotten. The empire sought to erase his memory. Statues toppled, coins melted, his name struck from records. Yet the legend of Elagabalus endured, not as a hero nor as a tyrant, but as a symbol of defiance, chaos, and the limits of imperial order. He was fire wrapped in silk, a blazing sun that the empire could not contain. Though the sun sets, its light casts shadows, and in those shadows the story of Elagabalus continues to flicker. A reminder of a time when the divine and the profane collided in a spectacle of power, identity, and madness. The rise of Elagabalus was not just the story of a boy who became emperor. It was the saga of an empire caught between tradition and transformation, between order and chaos. His youth in Emesa was steeped in ritual and spectacle, but Rome was a world apart, ruled by hardened politicians, pragmatic generals, and a populace weary of excess. The journey from the sun-scorched Syrian desert to the marble halls of Rome was both physical and symbolic. It was the passage from a sacred childhood bound by prophecy into a violent adulthood shaped by political intrigue and mortal peril. Elagabalus's entourage traveled slowly, carrying with them relics and symbols meant to awe and inspire. The black meteorite, the aniconic emblem of the sun god, was his most treasured possession. According to legend, the stone had fallen from the heavens, imbued with divine power. The priests who accompanied him told tales of its miraculous nature, of how it blessed those who touched it with fortune and favor. The crowds lining the roads to Rome were a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and apprehension. Few had seen an emperor so young, so flamboyant, and so openly defiant of Roman norms. Upon reaching the city, Elagabalus's arrival was unlike any before it. There was no thunder of cavalry, no clashing of swords. Instead, there was incense and chanting, swirling veils and glittering gold. The black stone was placed atop a chariot drawn by white horses, and the sun god's priests, garbed in exotic robes, danced through the streets in ecstatic worship. The spectacle was mesmerizing and disturbing in equal measure. Rome, the heart of the civilized world, this display of foreign gods and sensual excess was both fascinating and alien. The emperor's court quickly became a crucible of power and scandal. Elagabalus surrounded himself with people from the East, priests, dancers, courtiers, who embraced the sun god's cult and its rituals. He bestowed lavish gifts and titles on those who served him well, often to the dismay of traditional Roman elites. The old guard saw him as a madman, a heretic, a threat to the very fabric of Roman society, yet to his supporters and some common folk he was a breath of fresh air, a divine figure promising renewal and change. One of the most controversial aspects of Elagabalus's reign was his personal life, which flagrantly defied Roman social conventions. The emperor did not hide his love for men, openly celebrating relationships that shocked the conservative aristocracy. He took lovers with the same pomp and ceremony as a traditional husband. His most famous consort, Hierocles, was a charioteer of humble origins, elevated to a status that scandalized the Senate. Elagabalus reportedly wore women's clothing, called himself a bride, and sought surgical means to physically transform his body. Such acts were unheard of in Roman culture, where rigid gender roles defined social order and power. These personal choices were more than mere eccentricities. They were a deliberate challenge to the Roman worldview. By blurring the lines between male and female, sacred and profane, ruler and servant, Elagabalus embodied the chaos that lurked beneath the surface of imperial Rome. Some historians speculate that his actions were influenced by his devotion to the sun god, who was worshipped as both male and female, embodying the unity of opposites. Others see in him the tragic figure of a young man trying to reconcile his identity with the brutal realities of power. The emperor's extravagance extended beyond his personal life. His palace became a stage for endless spectacles. Banquets were legendary for their excess. Fountains ran with perfumed wine, exotic animals wandered freely, and guests were showered with precious jewels and flowers. The scent of incense and spices filled every corner. Music and dance were constant companions. Some nights, it was said, Elagabalus would release lions and leopards among his guests, adding a dangerous thrill to the festivities. The boundaries between revelry and madness were thin, and rumors of his wild behavior spread quickly through Rome. Despite the decadence, the political situation remained precarious. The Roman Senate, traditionally the heart of power and governance, found itself increasingly marginalized. Elagabalus showed little respect for their authority, often mocking senators and replacing them with loyalists from his eastern court. This alienated many powerful figures who had once supported the Severan dynasty. The Praetorian Guard, responsible for protecting the emperor, began to question their loyalty. Many soldiers were uncomfortable with Elagabalus' behavior and his disregard for Roman military traditions. Julia Maesa, the emperor's grandmother, became the linchpin of his rule. A woman of immense political savvy, she navigated the treacherous waters of imperial politics with a keen eye. Initially, she championed Elagabalus as a way to secure her family's hold on power. But as the emperor's excesses grew and his support waned, she started to consider alternatives. Her eyes turned to another grandson, Alexander Severus, who embodied the disciplined, traditional Roman ruler that many longed for. Julia Maesa began to orchestrate a quiet coup, cultivating support among senators, generals, and the Praetorian Guard. Elagabalus's awareness of the shifting tides led him to paranoia and desperation. He replaced his Praetorian Guards with his own loyalists, executed suspected conspirators, and indulged in more extravagant displays of power, hoping to awe and intimidate his enemies. But fear could not mask the deepening isolation he faced. The city that had once been awestruck by his arrival now murmured of madness and decadence. His reign became a powder keg, and in 222 AD it finally exploded. The Praetorian Guard, long the kingmakers of Rome, turned against Elagabalus. In a swift and brutal coup, they stormed the imperial palace. Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Soaemias, fled to a temple chamber, seeking divine protection. They prayed fervently to El-Gabal, but the sun god's favor was gone. The guards found them, and with little ceremony, the boy priest and the emperor were killed. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, stripped of dignity, and discarded in the sewers, a grim symbol of the end of an era. The aftermath of Elagabalus's fall was a concerted effort by the Roman elite to erase his memory. Statues were torn down, coins melted, inscriptions defaced. The empire sought to forget the sun god's impious servant who had challenged every tradition. Yet the legacy of Elagabalus could not be so easily buried. In the centuries that followed, he became a figure of legend and infamy, a cautionary tale of hubris, excess, and the dangers of defying the established order. His life and reign continue to fascinate historians and storytellers, embodying the tension between chaos and control, identity and power. In the aftermath of Elagabalus's violent demise, Rome struggled to come to terms with the whirlwind that had been his reign. The city's marble streets, once resonating with the ecstatic chants of Eastern priests and perfumed with exotic incense, now echoed with whispered fears and hushed conversations about the boy emperor's audacity. His death was not simply the fall of a ruler, but the symbolic end of a chapter in Roman history, marked by an unprecedented collision between the ancient world's traditional order and the mysticism of foreign cults. To many, Elagabalus was a cautionary tale of excess and divine madness. Yet to others, he represented a complex figure, a young man caught between mortal frailty and celestial ambition, struggling to shape his own identity in an empire that prized strength and conformity above all else. The story of Elagabalus did not vanish into oblivion as his enemies intended. Despite official attempts to erase him from history, tales of the sun priest turned emperor endured, transmitted through the writings of Roman historians, the whispers of common folk, and later the imaginations of artists and scholars. These accounts varied widely, some portraying him as a depraved tyrant, others as a misunderstood mystic, and still others as a tragic figure crushed by the very empire he sought to transform. In the centuries that followed, Elagabalus's life would inspire countless interpretations, each revealing as much about the observer's values and fears as about the man himself. His devotion to the god El-Gabal, the sun deity whose sacred black meteorite had been his talisman, remained a focal point of his legacy. The cult of Elagabal, introduced into Rome with dramatic fervor, challenged the polytheistic traditions that had defined Roman religion for centuries. By elevating a single foreign god above the pantheon, Elagabalus not only disrupted spiritual practices, but also symbolized a broader cultural and political shift. The emperor's insistence on the supremacy of El-Gabal was in many ways a radical expression of monotheistic impulse centuries before Christianity would rise to prominence within the empire. This religious upheaval unsettled Rome's elite and the populace alike, who viewed it as both a betrayal of tradition and a dangerous concentration of power. Elagabalus's personal life, especially his open defiance of gender norms and sexual conventions, contributed heavily to his controversial reputation. In an empire where masculinity was intertwined with power and authority, his adoption of feminine attire and roles was perceived as an affront to Roman values. His relationships with men and his public declarations of marriage to male partners scandalized the Senate and alienated many. The emperor's reputed desire to undergo gender transformation surgery, seeking to acquire female organs, though debated among historians, underscores the extent to which he challenged the era's rigid social structures. These acts, whether sincere or symbolic, made Elagabalus a figure of fascination and revulsion, embodying the tension between individual identity and societal expectation. The excesses of Elagabalus's court, the lavish banquets, the fragrant rosewater fountains, the wild animals roaming the palace, and the hypnotic dances, served as both celebration and provocation. They illustrated a world where traditional Roman restraint gave way to an exuberant embrace of pleasure, spectacle, and the exotic. Some viewed this as decadence run amok, a symptom of imperial decline. Others saw it as an expression of cultural fusion, the blending of Eastern mysticism and Roman grandeur in a vibrant, if volatile, synthesis. In this way, the palace under Elagabalus became a microcosm of the empire's wider tensions between order and chaos, tradition and innovation, the known and the mysterious. Despite these polarizing elements, Elagabalus's reign was not without moments of political and administrative activity. His governance, though overshadowed by scandal, included efforts to elevate his supporters and reshape the imperial bureaucracy according to his vision. He appointed priests and courtiers from his native Syria to key positions, disrupting the established Roman aristocracy's hold on power. These appointments were both a source of loyalty and resentment, contributing to the factionalism that plagued his rule. The emperor's youth and unconventional behavior complicated the delicate balance of Roman politics, leaving him vulnerable to intrigue and betrayal. Julia Maza's role during and after Elagabalus's reign remains a testament to the enduring power of political maneuvering. As the matriarch of the Severan dynasty, her influence was both protective and pragmatic. Initially, she had orchestrated Elagabalus' rise, leveraging his divine claims to secure her family's dominance. Yet when his excesses endangered their position, she deftly shifted support to Alexander Severe, ensuring the continuation of their lineage through a more acceptable figure. This transition marked a return to stability and traditional Roman values, but it also reflected the fragility of imperial power and the relentless currents of change within the empire. The manner of Elagabalus's death, brutal, swift, and ignominious, was designed to send a clear message. To Rome's elite, it symbolized the restoration of order and the rejection of the emperor's chaotic vision. Yet, the image of the boy Prius murdered in the very temple of his god haunted the city and its memory. His story, with its blend of divinity, decadence, and downfall, captured the imagination across generations, a narrative of brilliance and tragedy intertwined. In modern times, Elagabalus has become a figure of fascination for scholars and artists alike. His life raises profound questions about identity, power, and the boundaries of social norms. Was he a madman, a visionary, or both? Did his reign represent a desperate attempt to assert individuality in a system that crushed dissent? Or was he simply a product of his time, caught in the maelstrom of imperial politics and religious upheaval? These questions ensure that Elagabalus remains a compelling subject of study and storytelling. The emperor's legacy also resonates in contemporary discussions about gender, sexuality, and the nature of authority. His bold defiance of norms and his embrace of fluid identity challenged the often rigid narratives of history, reminding us that human experience has always been complex and multifaceted. Through Elagabalus's story, we glimpse the timeless struggles over who holds power, who defines normalcy, and how societies respond to those who transgress boundaries. Ultimately, the tale of Elagabalus is not just about a controversial emperor, but about the human quest for meaning and recognition. It is a story of a young boy elevated to divine status, attempting to carve his place in an unforgiving world. It is a story of faith and fanaticism, love and excess, power and downfall. His life blazed like the sun he worshipped, bright, intense, and brief, leaving behind shadows that continue to intrigue and inspire. The world into which Elagabalus was born was a place of contradictions, a sprawling empire balancing on the knife's edge between tradition and change. Rome, the eternal city, had long been the heart of power and civilization, its institutions forged in centuries of conquest and governance. Yet beneath its polished marble and orderly Senate chambers, currents of unrest and transformation flowed like hidden rivers. The Severn dynasty, to which Elagabalus belonged, was itself a symbol of this tension, rooted in Roman authority, yet infused with Eastern blood and customs. Elagabalus's early years were deeply entwined with the cult of El-Gabal, the sun god of Emesa. The boy priest was not merely a ceremonial figure. From his earliest days, he was trained to embody the divine will. His identity was shaped by rituals and symbols that transcended earthly concerns. The black meteorite, believed to be a fragment of the heavens, was central to this spiritual education. It was said that the stone held the power of the sun itself, a direct link between the mortal and the divine. In the shadows of the temple, the young Elagabalus learned to channel this power, his childhood marked by chants, offerings, and visions. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, recognized the potential of this divine aura as a political weapon. When the opportunity arose after Caracalla's death, she mobilized the legions of the East, promoting her grandson's claim to the throne. The Roman legions, weary of civil strife and eager for stability, were swayed by the promise of divine favor and the restoration of Severan legitimacy. Coins bearing Elagabalus's image circulated even before his arrival in Rome, a testament to the power of propaganda and myth. Upon his entrance to the capital, Elagabalus's presence was electric. Rome had never seen an emperor like him, youthful, flamboyant, and utterly unbound by convention. His arrival was a spectacle of light and sound, with exotic priests chanting in tongues unfamiliar to Roman ears. The streets were perfumed with incense, and the air thrummed with the rhythms of foreign drums. The black stone was paraded before the masses, an object of awe and confusion. Many Romans were unsettled. The sun god's cult was alien, its rituals un-Roman, its symbolism threatening the very foundations of Roman religious life. Elagabalus's religious reforms were swift and sweeping. He elevated El-Gabal above all other gods, demanding that the traditional Roman pantheon bow to his deity's supremacy. The old temples grew silent as new rituals took their place. The massive temple on the Palatine Hill became the epicenter of this spiritual revolution, its golden columns gleaming like the sun itself. The emperor personally led sacrifices and ceremonies, merging the roles of priest and ruler. This fusion of religious and political power unsettled the Senate, which saw its influence wane as the emperor's divine authority grew. Social norms, too, were upended. Elagabalus's embrace of Eastern customs extended to his personal conduct. He adorned himself in silks, jewels, and makeup, presenting a striking and unsettling image. His gender expression was fluid, at times assuming traditionally feminine roles in attire, at others displaying imperial authority with masculine bravado. He openly loved men and openly declared marriages that scandalized Rome's conservative elites. These actions were not simply personal eccentricities, they were public statements that challenged Roman ideals of masculinity, power, and order. The emperor's court was a whirlwind of decadence. Lavish banquets filled with exotic foods and intoxicating perfumes were common. Wild animals roamed freely through marble halls, and music and dance were constant companions. Guests were showered with gifts and flattered with attention, yet the atmosphere was charged with tension and unpredictability. Elagabalus's behavior, alternately charming, cruel, and capricious, kept courtiers on edge. The palace was a stage for his dramas, a place where reality and performance blurred. Yet beneath the glamour lay a fragile political reality. The Senate, though sidelined, still held power and influence, and its members grew increasingly hostile. The Praetorian Guard, tasked with protecting the emperor, was divided. Some were loyal to Elagabalus, others resented his disregard for military traditions and his preference for Eastern favorites. Julia Maesa played a critical role behind the scenes, balancing support for her grandson with pragmatic concern for the dynasty's survival. Her decision to back Alexander Severus as a rival was a turning point, signaling the beginning of Elagabalus's downfall. As Alexander's star rose, Elagabalus grew paranoid and erratic. He purged perceived enemies, altered guard assignments, and indulged in even more extravagant displays of power, hoping to reassert control. But the tide of political support had shifted irrevocably. In a violent coup orchestrated by the Praetorian Guard, Elagabalus was captured and executed alongside his mother. Their deaths were brutal, symbolizing the violent rejection of their disruptive reign. The legacy of Elagabalus is complex and contradictory. Officially condemned, his memory was damned, yet his story survived as a symbol of both excess and transformation. He challenged Roman conventions in religion, gender, and power, embodying a moment when the empire confronted its own limits. His life invites reflection on the nature of identity and authority, the clash of cultures, and the fragile balance of empire. Even today, Elagabalus's story resonates, inspiring art, literature, and historical debate. His brief, turbulent reign reminds us that history is shaped not only by those who conform, but also by those who defy, disrupt, and dare to be different. In the end, Elagabalus remains a blazing, enigmatic figure, a sun that burned too fiercely, casting shadows that endure across the centuries. As the flames of Elagabalus's brief but blazing reign flickered out, the empire began its painstaking process of recovery and restoration. The city of Rome, once dazzled and bewildered by the boy priestess' exotic rituals and unorthodox rule, sought solace in tradition and the comforting embrace of familiar gods and customs. Statues of Jupiter and Mars were restored to their places of honor. Temples that had fallen silent under Elagabalus's reforms were reopened with renewed vigor. The people, weary of spectacle and scandal, longed for stability and order. Yet, even as Rome turned away from the sun god's cult, the legacy of Elagabalus continued to ripple through the empire's cultural and political fabric. His reign exposed deep fissures within Roman society, fissures between East and West, tradition and innovation, rigidity and fluidity. The Severan dynasty, though renewed under Alexander Severus, could not entirely erase the impact of the boy who had dared to transform the empire in his own image. Elagabalus's challenge to gender and sexual norms, in particular, left a lasting, if often unspoken, mark. In a society that prized rigid masculine ideals, his open expression of fluid identity and love for men was revolutionary and threatening. Modern historians and scholars have revisited his life through contemporary lenses, viewing him as a complex figure navigating personal identity within a brutal political landscape. His story offers early echoes of struggles that continue to resonate in modern discussions about gender, power, and acceptance. The religious upheaval he initiated, though swiftly reversed, foreshadowed broader shifts in the spiritual life of the empire. The move from a polytheistic pantheon toward a focus on singular divine authority, however contested and brief under Elagabalus, anticipated the eventual rise of monotheism and the profound transformations that Christianity would bring. In this light, Elagabalus can be seen as a harbinger of change, a figure who, however flawed and controversial, embodied the restless currents sweeping through the ancient world. Despite the attempts to veify and erase him, Elagabalus's story endured in art, literature, and popular imagination. Renaissance artists painted him as the archetype of excess and decadence, a cautionary figure warning against the dangers of unchecked power and moral decay. Modern novels, films, and academic works explore the nuances of his reign, seeking to understand the man behind the myth. This enduring fascination speaks to the universal themes his life touches upon: the collision of youth and power, the struggle for identity, the seduction and peril of radical change. Ultimately, Elagabalus's life is a vivid testament to the complexities of human nature and history. He was a boy caught between worlds, East and West, mortal and divine, tradition and transformation. His reign was short but incandescent, a sunburst of brilliance and chaos that illuminated the fragility of empire and the enduring human quest for meaning and expression. Though history may judge him harshly, the shadows he cast continue to provoke thought and wonder, reminding us that the past is never simply a record of facts, but a living tapestry of stories, struggles, and dreams.